Yes, contracts definitely existed in the ancient Near East. Now, some scholars don't want to define them as a contract the way we might define it today, but I think we can say they were definite contracts because two parties would be involved and each party would give up something for the benefit of the other and expect to get something of benefit in return. And in my mind, that definitely counts as a contract. They were used for all sorts of things. They could be used for loans, so the debtor would give assent to a written contract that would say he was receiving X amount of goods or silver from the lender and he would have to repay it by a certain date, usually at a certain interest rate. 20% was a common rate, even 33% could be an interest rate. These weren't annual interest rates, these were just total interest rates, meaning he would have to pay back the principal plus 1/5 or 1/3, depending on what was decided. Contracts were also used for marriage agreements. Two families would enter an agreement saying, our son will marry your daughter and vice versa, and they would agree on financial terms as well, because the groom's family would have to pay a certain amount of money to the bride's family, and the bride's family would have to provide their daughter with a dowry, and these were often agreed upon ahead of time. Contracts could also be used between nations or between kings, and we would call these treaties, but they were based on the form of a contract, and each king would agree to certain terms, and they would have to be obligated to perform certain actions for the other king and hope to get a certain benefit in return. Contracts were used for other things as well. One person could rent out equipment that they had or even slaves that they owned to another person, and the terms for these agreements would be collected together into a contract. People would give assent to these contracts usually before witnesses, but we have written contracts as well, and sometimes they would make a mark on the contract. They might place their personal seal on the contract. The contracts would be recorded oftentimes on wet clay, and the person could then impress their seal onto the clay. Sometimes they would actually just make a mark with their fingernail. And we have a number of clay tablets that just have fingernail marks on them. You might say, well, how can you tell one person's fingernail mark from another person's? And basically you can't, but you would have names of witnesses recorded on the contract, and you would bring these witnesses to court if there was a dispute, and they would say yes or no as to whether or not the parties both agreed to the contract and made their mark with their fingernail on the contract. In some cases, you have slave contracts, and these would often involve debt slaves. So if a husband or a head of household, a father, couldn't pay his debt back on time, he might have to turn over one of his children to the creditor as a debt slave. And the terms for this would be recorded in a contract. And in some cases, only a handful, we have the footprint of the child impressed onto the clay as a way to say even this very young child was giving their assent to the terms of this debt slavery contract. So they used contracts for all sorts of things, from marriages to adoptions to sales to rentals, even to international contracts that we call treaties. And this form of making agreements permeated, it seems like, all of society, and people were generally familiar with this idea.